The door wasn't supposed to open, but on that day, it moved. The Cleveland Kidnappings. The escape. The day silence ended. For more than 10 years, this story unfolded behind closed doors, hidden in routine and silence. 3 lives existed in the same space, unseen by the world outside, shaped by rules designed to erase them from time. The house did not look unusual. The street did not feel dangerous, and that was how it endured. Part 6 is not about how it began or how long it lasted. It is about the moment that broke it open, the point where silence failed, where control slipped, and where survival demanded something louder than fear. This is the chapter where waiting ends, where secrecy gives way to risk, where one decision changes everything that follows. This is the escape. For years, the house on Seymour Avenue was quiet, not peaceful, not empty, just quiet in the way places become when no one is listening closely enough. Doors closed, windows stayed shut. Life moved past it without slowing down. On that day, nothing about the morning announced what was coming. The street looked the same. The walls stood where they always had. Inside, time did not feel different until it did. The sound did not arrive all at once. It pushed its way out. A voice, strained and unfamiliar, breaking through layers of wood and habit. It wasn't screaming in panic. It was calling out with intention, with urgency, with the certainty that silence was no longer an option. For a moment, the house resisted. It had held secrets before. It had swallowed noise for years. But this time, something shifted. A door moved where it wasn't supposed to. Light found a way through a space that had never been open long enough to matter. And just like that, the rules inside the house stopped working. What had been hidden for more than a decade did not collapse in an instant. It began to surface in fragments, in sound, in motion, in a decision that could not be taken back. The silence that protected the house was ending. That day did not begin with courage. It began the way most days inside the house did, with waiting. Waiting for footsteps, waiting for doors to open and close, waiting for the hours to pass without drawing attention to themselves. Nothing about the routine suggested that it would be different, and that was what made the difference possible. When the door closed behind him, the sound lingered longer than usual. Not because it was louder, but because it meant something. The house settled into a familiar stillness, the kind that had taught everyone inside to move carefully, to think quietly, to survive by remaining unnoticed. The door at the front was locked as it always was, heavy, reinforced, designed to stay shut. But not everything inside the house was as strong as it once had been. A chain hung where it shouldn't have been loose. A frame had shifted just enough to be felt if someone pressed against it the right way, at the right time. There was hesitation, not fear, but calculation. A pause measured in breaths, not seconds. The understanding that whatever happened next could not be undone, that trying and failing would change everything, and that not trying would change nothing at all. Hands moved where they were never meant to go. The door resisted, then responded, not with surrender, but with movement, barely noticeable at first, just enough to let air through, just enough to prove that the house was not sealed the way it pretended to be. In that narrow space between staying silent and being heard, a decision took shape. It was not loud. It did not feel heroic. It felt necessary. And once it was made, there was no returning to the rules that had kept the house in control for so long. The door had never been meant to open from the inside. Everything about it communicated finality. The weight pressing back against the body, the dull resistance that answered every touch, the sound it made when it closed, heavy and absolute, as if the house itself was drawing a line that could not be crossed. It was not designed to invite effort, it was designed to end it. At first, the door responded the way it always had, with nothing. Pressure met silence, and silence pressed back harder. The kind of response that convinces you to stop, that reminds you how many times before this exact moment had ended the same way. Years of stillness had taught the house that it could outlast patience. Hands stayed on the surface longer than they should have, not pushing, not pulling, just feeling. The edge of the frame, the place where wood met metal. The points that felt different, not weaker, but less certain. The door was old. The house was old. And age had quietly rearranged things that no one ever meant to examine this closely. The chain hung across the door, familiar and threatening. It had never failed. Not once. It had always been enough. But now, under pressure that did not rush or retreat, it shifted. Just slightly. Enough to register not as freedom, but as possibility. Enough to break the idea that it was fixed. There was a pause then. Not fear, calculation. The understanding that testing it again would change something, even if it didn't open. That once movement was felt, it could not be unfelt. The house had survived by discouraging exactly this moment. The second attempt was slower, deliberate. Weight transferred carefully, controlled, listening for resistance rather than forcing it. The metal answered again, this time with sound. Not a break, not a failure, a response. A faint scrape that carried more meaning than noise ever had in that house. Air moved through the space that formed. It was thin, barely noticeable, but unmistakably new. Light followed, slipping in where it had never been allowed to stay long enough to matter. The opening was small, imperfect, unreliable, but it existed. The house reacted, not with violence, but with disturbance. The familiar creak shifted location. The silence felt unsettled, no longer smooth, no longer complete. What had once absorbed movement now seemed to amplify it, as if the walls were adjusting to a condition they did not recognize. Hands returned to the chain again, this time without hesitation. The movement carried risk, but also momentum. Each second stretched, not because time slowed, but because attention sharpened. The door resisted one last time, then gave just enough to make going back impossible. The opening widened, not into freedom, into exposure. Enough for sound to travel, enough for the outside to become real. The door did not fall, it did not break, it moved. And in that movement, the house lost the certainty it had depended on for years. The moment silence broke. The first sound did not make sense. It arrived without context, slipping through the narrow opening in a way that felt almost accidental. Not loud enough to demand attention, not clear enough to be understood. Just enough to interrupt the rhythm of the street and make someone hesitate before continuing on. Inside the house, the voice carried weight, every word pressed against the boundaries that had kept everything contained. Sound had always been dangerous here. It traveled in ways movement could not, reaching places that bodies were never meant to go. Once released, it refused to stay controlled. The voice came again, stronger this time, not frantic, not rehearsed, shaped by urgency rather than fear. It wasn't shouting for sympathy. It was calling for recognition, repeating itself because repetition was the only way to break through disbelief. Outside, the sound triggered uncertainty before concern. A pause, a glance back toward the house. the hesitation that comes from not wanting to misinterpret something ordinary as something serious. For a moment, it was easier to assume there was an explanation than to accept that there might be a problem. The voice did not allow that comfort to last. It returned, uneven and persistent, pushing against the edges of the walls, slipping through cracks where sound had never belonged. The tone carried intention. Someone inside was trying to be heard, not once, but continuously, as if understanding that the first attempt might be dismissed. Inside, time felt exposed. Every call risked attention that could not be controlled. Every second stretched longer, heavy with consequence, but stopping was no longer an option. Silence had already been broken, and breaking it again felt safer than retreating. Outside, listening turned into recognition. The sound began to take shape, not just as noise, but as meaning. It did not belong to the house. It did not fit the place it was coming from. It carried a weight that demanded response. Movement followed, not coordinated, not planned, instinctive. Someone stepped closer. Someone else stayed where they were, watching. The street adjusted, slowly, uncertainly, as the idea that something was wrong settled into the space. The house had relied on distance for years, on the belief that walls were enough. But sound does not respect distance the way silence does. Once it escapes, it invites attention. The voice moved again through the opening, carrying with it a truth the house could no longer contain. What had once belonged only to the inside was now pressing outward, where it could be questioned, where it could be acted upon. Someone was listening now, and once that happened, the sound no longer belonged to the house at all. What followed did not arrive as a single decisive action. It unfolded in fragments, layered one over another, each response shaped by uncertainty rather than certainty. No one on the street understood the full picture yet, but understanding was no longer required to act. The door became the center of attention, not as an object, but as a question. Hands hovered near it before touching it, as if waiting for permission that would never come. The house still looked ordinary from the outside, unchanged, resistant to the idea that anything inside it could justify intervention. Inside, everything tightened. Sound multiplied, overlapping itself. Footsteps no longer followed familiar patterns. The careful, contained movements that had governed life inside the walls gave way to urgency that could not be choreographed. The house had never learned how to hold more than one intention at a time. Someone knocked, not hard enough to break anything, but hard enough to announce presence. The sound carried inward, heavier than it should have been, because it did not belong there. It came from the outside, from a world the house had kept at a distance for years. There was shouting now, not chaotic, but uncontrolled. Voices crossed paths, none of them fully certain what they were responding to, only that ignoring it was no longer an option. The street adjusted again, shifting from observation to involvement. A phone was lifted. Numbers were pressed quickly without deliberation. Words spilled out faster than they could be ordered, but urgency did the work that clarity could not. The call did not explain everything. It did not need to. It only needed to be believed. Inside the house, time collapsed inward. Seconds felt compressed, stripped of their usual structure. There was no space left for hesitation, no silence left to retreat into. The protection that secrecy once provided was dissolving under the weight of attention. Pressure returned to the door, this time from the outside. Not testing, not cautious, purposeful. The house absorbed it unevenly, its balance shifting with each attempt. The authority it had relied on was failing, not because it had weakened, but because it was being challenged by more than one force at once. The rules no longer applied cleanly. Control fractured, splintering into moments that could not be managed or contained. What had been private was becoming visible through repetition, through insistence, through the simple refusal of others to step away. The house had survived by being overlooked. That protection was gone now. And once others stepped in, there was no path back to silence, no version of events where the door closed and the house reclaimed its authority. The door did not open all at once. It resisted even now, as if holding on to the authority it had exercised for years. But the resistance no longer felt absolute. It felt delayed. The kind that knows it is about to fail, even as it tries one last time to pretend otherwise. The first real opening came with sound, not the voice anymore, not shouting, but the unmistakable noise of force meeting structure. Wood strained, metal shifted. The house answered with unfamiliar echoes, the kind it had never allowed to form inside its walls. Outside, movement sharpened. What had begun as scattered reactions pulled into alignment, attention focused, hands steadied. The uncertainty that had slowed everything before gave way to urgency that no longer needed explanation. Inside, space changed shape. Rooms that had always felt sealed suddenly felt exposed, as if their boundaries were thinning under the pressure. The house was no longer a closed system. Air moved differently now. Sound carried farther than it should have. When the door finally gave way, it did not announce itself with drama. There was no clean break, no single moment to point to. Just a shift, a widening, enough to allow bodies that did not belong to the house to cross its threshold. That crossing mattered. It was the first time the inside was no longer controlled by what lived there. The first time the rules that had governed movement, sound, and survival lost their authority. The house had been entered, and with that, it had been exposed. Light followed, not carefully, not politely. It spread into spaces that had learned to live without it, illuminating corners that had relied on darkness to remain unchanged. The contrast was immediate and unforgiving. Voices overlapped again, this time with direction. Questions were asked quickly, instructions followed. The rhythm inside the house no longer belonged to it. It belonged to the people who had arrived uninvited and unwilling to leave things as they were. And then there was the realization. This was not a single voice, not a single person, not a misunderstanding. The house held more than one life where only silence had been expected, more than one presence where absence had been assumed. Names were spoken carefully, almost cautiously, as if saying them too loudly might fracture something fragile. Each one confirmed what the house had worked to deny, that what was happening could not be contained, minimized, or dismissed. The door stood open now, not as a passage, but as evidence. What had been hidden behind it was no longer hidden. What had been controlled was no longer contained. The house had lost. The realization did not arrive with urgency. It arrived slowly, settling into the space like something heavy that could not be moved once it was placed there. The house had already given up one truth. Now it was being asked to give up more. Movement continued through the rooms, measured and careful. Doors were open that had never been meant to open in front of witnesses. Each one revealed not answers, but presence. Signs of life where absence had been assumed for years. The light reached places it had never touched directly. It revealed outlines before details, shapes before faces. The contrast was almost disorienting. Spaces that had existed in shadow adjusting reluctantly to being seen. Someone spoke a name. It was said quietly, not as a call, but as a confirmation. as if saying it too loudly might overwhelm what came next. The sound of it changed the atmosphere inside the house, turning discovery into understanding. There were others. They did not rush forward. There was no sudden movement, no dramatic crossing of space. What followed was cautious, deliberate, shaped by the awareness that survival had required patience for a very long time. Trust did not return instantly. It unfolded in small gestures, in stillness that waited to be respected. Another name was spoken, then another. Each one carried its own weight, not because of who it belonged to, because of how long it had been missing from the world outside the house. These were not echoes. They were lives, present and real, emerging into a moment that could not be undone. The house felt smaller now, not because it had changed shape, but because it could no longer hide what it contained. Its walls no longer protected secrets, they framed them. Attention shifted gently, almost instinctively, from the structure to the people inside it. The house was losing relevance. What mattered now were the lives that had endured within it. When they stepped into the light, it was not a release, it was an adjustment. The world outside did not rush to meet them. It waited, uncertain how to receive what it had failed to notice for so long. The silence that had defined the house for years was gone, not replaced by noise, but by presence. The truth had not broken through all at once. It had emerged person by person, name by name, and with that, the house no longer had anything left to hold. The house still stands, quiet and ordinary, as if nothing ever happened inside. From the outside, it gives no explanation, no warning, no memory of what it once contained. But silence was never harmless. It protected what should never have been hidden. When that silence finally broke, it didn't erase the past. It only forced the world to look at what it had missed for years. And for those who survived, everything changed, forever. Next on True Echoes. The door opened, but the story did not end there. What followed was not relief, but exposure. Courtrooms, cameras, and a nation trying to understand what it had missed for years. Justice would be argued, measured, and sentenced, while survival took on a new and unfamiliar shape. For those who walked out of the house, freedom did not arrive quietly. Life after captivity demanded answers, strength, and time. Part 6. Aftermath. Life after the house. Coming soon on True Echoes. And when silence finally broke, everything changed. What part of this silence stayed with you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'm listening. And step into the echoes of truth. To be continued.